Scarlet.
A very warm welcome to everybody here. This 11th meeting of Soteria. Well, 12th meeting of Soteria. 12th meeting, thank you for the correction. And the last one of 2021. And I don't think that Stedman needs much of an introduction. I think you all know him. And he's going to talk about Dr. Johnson, who is, at least for me, one of those names that, of course, I'm familiar with. But if I were put on the spot to talk for any amount of time about him, I would probably falter after the first 2 or 3 minutes. So with no further ado, I should like to hand over to Stead.
My talk is not about the vast topic that is Dr. Johnson, so much as him as the author of Rasselas and that particular work. How might a man of means, who has not the necessity of work to sustain himself, find the ideal form of life in which to reside in happiness, happiness being conceived as life's proper purpose? While Rasselas awaits the call of succession to the throne of Abyssinia, as is the custom of the country, he is confined within the so-called Happy Valley, an Edenic dell enclosed by mountains wherein all the principal requirements for comfortable subsistence are provided, in like fashion as they will be to a passenger taking a cruise upon a luxury liner. But this conduces not to the purposed end of happiness for the prince, and the desire slowly grows in him to see if he can find it in the world beyond the stony walls. With Imlac, a sympathetic companion, his own sister, Princess Nakaya, and her companion Pekua, he effects an escape, and the four begin the adventure, travelling to different places and asking different people how happy they are in the mode of life they have chosen. That is the bare plot of this history of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia. The choice of life was what he'd earlier thought to title it, and that remains the central question, threading through the sundry episodes, and indeed the phrase itself appears 11 times in the text. Unlike other narratives wherein the protagonist travels in search of something, such as in Ibsen's Peer Gynt, where, if one so interprets it, what he sets out to find, the authenticity of one's own self, he finds already always having been there at home when he returns. At the conclusion to Rasselas, no specific universal answer to the initial question is discovered, which may be understood as consistent with Dr. Johnson's general attitude of consoled pessimism, expressed in the words of one of the characters, Imlac, that in life there is much to be endured, little to be enjoyed. This was not unconsoled because he was a man of religious faith. There was consolation in that this was the way things were supposed to be, so it was not our place to wish that they were other than they were, and to be grateful for any pleasure that was to be found in this particular, in the world before the afterlife. Why did he write the book? According to Boswell, Rasselas was written in the evenings of 1 week to defray the expenses of his mother's funeral, thus putting into the mind of the reader, apart from the admiration of the author's industry, a low expectation of the work's sincerity and quality, and a high expectation that the emotional tenor running through it and the choice and treatment of its philosophical themes will reflect the mind of a man in mourning, evinced in the visit to the catacombs and the dissertation upon death and the soul at the end of the book. That his need for money was urgent is clear in a letter he wrote to the printer, William Strahan, to which, after having signed it, he added below in emphasis and in summary, "Get me the money if you can." That the work bears the signs of a literary potboiler is not sustained, I would suggest, in the care with which it is written and in how it becomes a natural, apt literary vehicle for the concerns which he'd been addressing in his output of essays for diverse magazines in the preceding 2 decades. in particular for the Rambler and the Idler on subjects such as hope, happiness, and patience. And although contributing to these periodicals, in the case of the Rambler as almost the sole contributor, was his principal source of livelihood, this species of writing was evidently consonant with what he thought was his vocation. He also preached sermons, which are a rather little known part of his writing, and undoubtedly he regarded himself as a moralist, perhaps after the model of a Seneca or a Cicero. So compositionally, to cast intelligent debate in the flow of a story was as artistically legitimate as it was to be proven successful. From certain literary critics, it was the lack of what had then become the tropes of an established genre of fervid Oriental tales that titillated the reader with exoticism and voluptuousness, which had drawn disappointed disfavour. Not even a magic carpet was to be found. From the public, however, there came but quick approbation, and a secondary printing had to be made within 2 months after the first. And this favour has continued, with to date around 500 editions in English and over 130 translations. Was this choice of cultural and geographical location purely because it was deemed more colourful and therefore more likely to draw the public in? Or did he find that it brought the matters he wished to address into sharper relief than if he tried to situate the tale in England? The ostensive answer may be neither. The first book he had published had been a translation from the French of A Voyage to Abyssinia by Father Geronimo Lobo, a Portuguese Jesuit missionary who had spent many years in North Africa, some of them attempting to bring the Abyssinian patriarchate, part of the Oriental Orthodox Church, into the orbit of papal control, politically and doctrinally. In distinction to the Roman Catholics and to all the major denominations, Protestant as well as Orthodox, these Ethiopian Christians were, and they still are, Monophysite, or more accurately, Monophysite, in that they believed that Jesus had one nature, divine and human, rather than two natures within the one person of the Trinity. Monophysite implies historically that the human nature is held to be totally subsumed within the divine, like a cube of ice becoming dissolved in water, some sort of obverse to Arianism, which which denied the divinity of Jesus. Although it's not referred to in the text, one might assume that Rasselas and his companions professed therefore the same general Christian faith as the author, and they stand alike in opposition to the papacy, and this one wouldn't otherwise be aware of. It's not mentioned. This account by the Jesuit was not the only thing about the Orient that he had read. Dr. Johnson provided the preface to a 20-volume collection of travel writings mainly concerning the East called The World Displayed, and he describes Lady Mary Wortley Montagu's account of her life at the Ottoman court as, in quotes, the only non-obligatory book he had ever read cover to cover. Not quite sure what he meant by non-obligatory, but that shows that he found it very interesting at any rate. The publication in 1706 of the Arabian Nights Entertainment, an anonymous English translation from the French of Anton Galland's first edition in a European language of the Arabic 1001 Nights, sparked a spate of publications designed to satisfy the appetite that had thereby been created, and Dr. Johnson seems both to have ridden this wave of interest and to have shared it. There's a noteworthy precursor to Rasselas in the History of 10 Days of Seged, the Emperor of Ethiopia, which Dr. Johnson published in 2 consecutive editions of the Rambler. This was also, as one might assume, set in Abyssinia, and similarly charted another such search for happiness. William Shaw, a Gaelic scholar and friend of the author, reported that it is known to many of the Doctor's friends that his Rasselas was an early conception on which his ideas were matured long before the completion of the work. He had in fact once before used an Oriental Islamic setting in a significant work, namely in his drama Irene, which was finished and staged in 1749, 10 years earlier than the publication of Rasselas, and whose plot devolves upon the capture of the eponymous lady by Sultan Mehmed II, who offers her either marriage and conversion or death. She chooses to become his wife, but is murdered later as a result of a court intrigue. If I had had more time, I should like to have been able to read the book which came out 10 years ago, being the only study of this matter, I think, Dr. Johnson's Attitude Towards Islam by Ghazi Nazir. He was a man of great intelligence and mental acuity, and although he might have taken pleasure in discharging peremptory and bathatic animadversions, his thoughts about complex topics were necessarily complex. As an evangelically inclined Anglican Christian, he would have regarded Islam as the wrong religion, not the religion most consistent with what he understood as revelation. But he had respect for it inasmuch as it was a sincere worship of the Almighty, and indeed apparently for its founder, to whom these words of his refer. His purely historical character, his simple humility, his claiming to be a man among men, his intense realism, avoiding all mystical remoteness, the thoroughly democratic and universal form under which his idea of divine monarchy led him to conceive the relations of man, the force of ethical appeal, all affiliate Muhammad with the modern world. That's an unexpected quote, and it takes one's mind down a novel avenue in considering how aspects of Islam might well have appealed to Dr. Johnson, the clearly articulated duties, the simplicity of the theology, and the generality of its vision. The Islamic characters in the book are surprisingly civilized. The Arab who abducts the princess, the sister of Rasselas, in order to obtain a ransom, is portrayed as a man of honor, whose avocation is for the pleasures of the mind rather than the body, and he only resorts to this way of life because of the invasion and domination of his lands by the Turks. Dr. Johnson wrote on more than one occasion that human nature is always the same, and his direction in describing different cultures is towards what is common, not what differentiates. The same regard for the general is present in his refusal to dwell on differences in religion, not to emphasize the Islamic in distinction to the Christian. I shall return to this point. Rasselas was written in the middle of the 7 Years' War, which resulted in the defeats by Britain of France upon multiple fronts in India, Canada, Germany, and the West Indies, and the establishment of British domination over much of the world. No doubt, as a man not of doctrinaire, but of practical policy, he would have had more to say about these matters. But in short, he was definitely no supporter of slavery, empire, or colonialism. He acknowledged the technical superiority of Europeans within the age in which he lived, but he did not ascribe a particular reason to it, and he acknowledged that others, such as the Egyptians, had been ascendant in former times. Rasselas asks Imlach why the Europeans are more powerful. He replies, because they are wiser, that knowledge will always predominate over ignorance as man governs the other animals. But why their knowledge is more than ours, I know not what reason can be given, but the unsearchable will of the Supreme Being. Here and elsewhere, the reader is uniquely fortunate in being able to seek help in clarifying the meaning of any sentence by seeing how the author defined the crucial words in his own dictionary, which is now easily available online. In this passage, the crucial word is wise. and the prevalent sense that Dr. Johnson recorded for the word is having practical knowledge. So that explains the statement he made about the Europeans. The issue of the anomaly of the genre to which this work belongs still remains. But as with anything, the main issue is whether the object is of any good, whatever it might be classified as. A moral fable is a fair description of what Rasselas is, and one name for this is an apologue, which is used to designate the pedagogic short stories of Aesop and La Fontaine. These are of such brevity that their author could conceive at once the point he wished to teach, and almost at the same time the plot with which he wished to express it. Dr. Johnson's story is of such length that one may doubt whether he knew the ending when writing the beginning. That's to say, the work reads as an ongoing inquiry couched in a narrative, episodic form. Rasselas was published anonymously, which was not uncommon, but the stateliness of the prose, the periodic parallelism of sentence structure, the emphatic expression, and the tendency to turn every utterance into a philosophical maxim made Johnson's authorship readily discernible. Dr. Johnson believed that the general was superior to the specific, and his writing is characterized by an attempt to see it in the particular. The greatest truth would be the truth that admitted no exceptions, that attained to universal validity. If he can describe what is happening without detail, he does so. One corollary of this is the dependence of his vocabulary upon latinate abstractions, which has often been the target of parody and jibe. Another point an early reviewer, William Haley, noted was that every speaker speaks like the author. That, he says, I hardly ever hear a sentence uttered by the princess or the lady Pefferer, but I see the enormous Johnson in petticoats. That is another result of his disinclination towards particularity, that he did not wish to characterize each character. What separates person from person is less important than what they share. There's a profound humanity in this, although also a certain superficial monotony. He was also suspicious of fiction as such, as falsehood and fantasy, leading the mind away from reason and into obsession and insanity. Personally, he suffered from bouts of depression and at times worried that he might fall into madness. There are numerous parallels that might be made between the story and Dr. Johnson's biography. The Happy Valley as his childhood in Lichfield, Cairo as the London he left it to visit, Imlac's unsuccessful courtship recalling his own with Molly Aston, the description of flying reflecting an actual, almost obsessive interest he had in flying due to some of the medical conditions he was suffering from, according to Thomas Kiemer. Putting Rasselas and the pursuit of happiness into a wider frame, it was 17 years later that the Declaration of Independence came to be written, wherein the same reduction of the purpose of life as propounded in the story was employed to found a country. Dr. Johnson would have not concurred with the emphasis given in the document to rights, as his conception of ethics was based on duties. But there's evidence that he and Thomas Jefferson shared an apprehension of the distinction between pursuing and obtaining happiness, and the sense that it might be mainly in the pursuit that the obtaining was to be had. I opened this introduction by stating, or trying to, that the philosophical problem of the story of Rasselas addresses that of how a man of means, without the necessity of work to sustain himself, might find the ideal mode of life in which to reside in happiness. The solution, to me, it seems to lie in the opposite direction to Dr. Johnson's tendency towards generalization. No one is born into an abstract set of infinite variables. Each person comes into a concrete world of limitations. Rasselas is born to become a future king. Unless he thinks there's something wrong in that which it's valid for him to consider, his happiness lies in becoming the best king he can. That's the material answer to the question. The material answer to the question of one's choice in life lies in the concrete and the limited. But the general and the infinite, that is a direction of travel for the mind and for the soul. These are my final thoughts on this excellently entertaining work, which I think thoroughly deserves its longevity. And with that, I think we can begin to sample some of his very characteristic prose. Luckily, the chapters are about the right length for one person to read, so I think we can all attempt one chapter. Who would like to start off the first chapter? Any volunteers? Michael, great. Right, let's screen share.
The History of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia. Chapter 1, Description of a Palace in a Valley. Ye who listen with credulity to the whispers of fancy, and pursue with eagerness the phantoms of hope, who expect that age will perform the promises of youth, and that the deficiencies of the present day will be supplied by the morrow, attend to the history of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia. Rasselas was the fourth son of the mighty emperor, in whose dominions the Father of Waters begins his course, whose bounty powers down the streams of plenty and scatters over half the world the harvests of Egypt. According to the custom which has descended from age to age among the monarchs of the torrid zone, he was confined in a private palace with the other sons and daughters of Abyssinian royalty till the order of succession should call him to the throne. The place which the wisdom or policy of antiquity had destined for the residence of the Abyssinian princes was a spacious valley in the kingdom of Amhara, surrounded on every side by mountains, of which the summits overhang the middle part. The only passage by which it could be entered was a cavern that passed under a rock, of which it had long been disputed whether it was the work of nature or of human industry. The outlet of the cavern was concealed by a thick wood, and the mouth which opened into the valley was closed with gates of iron forged by the artificers of ancient days, so massy that no man could, without the help of engines, open or shut them. From the mountains on every side, rivulets descended that filled all the valley with verdure and fertility, and formed a lake in the middle inhabited by fish of every species, and frequented by every fowl whom nature has taught to dip the wing in water. This lake discharged its superfluities by a stream which entered a dark cleft of the mountain on the northern side, and fell with dreadful noise from precipice to precipice, till it was heard no more. The sides of the mountains were covered with trees. The banks of the brooks were diversified with flowers. Every blast shook spices from the rocks, and every month dropped fruits upon the ground. All animals that bite the grass or browse the shrub, whether wild or tame, wander in this extensive circuit, secured from beasts of prey by the mountains which confine them. On one part were flocks and herds feeding in the pastures on another all the beasts of chase frisking in the lawns. The sprightly kid was bounding on the rocks, the subtle monkey frolicking in the trees, and the solemn elephant reposing in the shade. All the diversities of the world were brought together. The blessings of nature were collected, and its evils extracted and excluded. The valley, wide and fruitful, supplied its inhabitants with the necessities of life, and all delights and superfluities were added at the annual visit which the emperor paid his children, when the iron gate was opened to the sound of music. And during 8 days, everyone that resided in the valley was required to propose whatever might contribute to make seclusion pleasant, to fill up the vacancies of attention and lessen the tediousness of time. Every desire was immediately granted. All the artificers of pleasure were called to gladden the festivity. The musicians exerted the power of harmony, and the dancers shewed their activity before the princes in hope that they should pass their lives in this blissful captivity, to which these only were admitted whose performance was thought to add novelty to luxury. Such was the appearance of security and delight which this retirement afforded, that they to whom it was new always desired that it might be perpetual, and as those on whom the iron gate had once closed were never suffered to return, the effect of longer experience could not be known. Thus, every year produced new schemes of delight and new competitors for imprisonment. The palace stood on an eminence raised by 30 paces above the surface of the lake. It was divided into many squares or courts, built with greater or lesser magnificence according to the rank of those for whom they were designed. The roofs were turned into arches of massy stone joined with a cement that grew harder by time, and the building stood from century to century, deriding the solstitial rains and equinoctial hurricanes without need of reparation. This house, which was so large as to be fully known to none but some ancient officers who successively inherited the secrets of the place, was built as if suspicion herself had dictated the plan. To every room there was an open and secret passage. Every square had a communication with the rest, either from the upper stories by private galleries or by subterranean passages from the lower apartments. Many of the columns had unsuspected cavities in which successive monarchs reposited their treasures. They then closed up the opening with marble, which was never to be removed, but in the utmost exigencies of the kingdom, and recorded their accumulations in a book which was itself concealed in a tower not entered but by the emperor, attended by the prince who stood next in succession.
Thank you very much. Robin, would you be willing to take up the baton?
Yes, all right. Chapter 2, The Discontent of Rasselas in the Happy Valley. Here the sons and daughters of Abyssinia lived, only to know the soft vicissitudes of pleasure and repose, attended by all that was skillful to delight, and gratified with whatever the senses can enjoy. They wandered in gardens of fragrance and slept in the fortresses of security. Every art was practiced to make them pleased with their own condition. The sages who instructed them told them of nothing but the miseries of public life, and described all beyond the mountains as regions of calamity, where discord was always raging and where man preyed upon man. To heighten their opinion of their own felicity, they were daily entertained with songs, the subject of which was the Happy Valley. Their appetites were excited by the frequent enumerations of different enjoyments, and revelry and merriment was the business of every hour, from the dawn of morning to the close of even. These methods were generally successful. Few of the princes had ever wished to enlarge their bounds, but passed their lives in full conviction that they had all within their reach that art or nature could bestow, and pitied those whom fate had excluded from this feat of tranquility as the sport of chance and the slaves of misery. Thus they rose in the morning and lay down at night, pleased with each other and with themselves, all but Rasselas, who in the 26th year of his age began to withdraw himself from their pastimes and assemblies, and to delight in solitary walks and silent meditation. He often sat before tables covered with luxury, and forgot to taste the dainties that were placed before him. He arose abruptly in the midst of the song, and hastily retired beyond the sound of music. His attendants observed the change and endeavored to renew his love of pleasure. He neglected their endeavors, repulsed their invitations, and spent day after day on the banks of rivulets sheltered with trees, where he sometimes listened to the birds in the branches, sometimes observed the fish playing in the stream, and anon cast his eyes upon the pastures mountains filled with animals, of which some were biting the herbage and some sleeping among the bushes. This singularity of his humor made him much observed. One of the sages, in whose conversation he had formerly delighted, followed him secretly in hope of discovering the cause of his disquiet. Rasselas, who knew not that anyone was near him, having for some time fixed his eyes upon the goats that were browsing around the rocks, began to compare their condition with his own. "What," said he, "makes a difference between man and all the rest of the animal creation? Every beast that strays beside me has the same corporal necessities with myself. He is hungry and crops the grass. He is thirsty and drinks the stream. His thirst and hunger are appeased. He is satisfied and sleeps. He rises again and is hungry. He is again fed and is at rest. I am hungry and thirsty like him. But when thirst and hunger cease, I'm not at rest. I am like him, pained with want, but I'm not like him, satisfied with fullness. The intermediate hours are tedious and gloomy. I long again to be hungry, that I may again quicken my attention. The birds peck the berries or the corn and fly away to the groves, where they sit in seeming happiness on the branches, and waste their lives in tuning one unvaried series of sounds. I likewise can call the lutanist and the singer, for the sounds that pleased me yesterday weary me today, and will grow yet more wearisome tomorrow. I can discover within me no power of perception which is not glutted with its proper pleasure, yet I do not feel myself delighted. Man has surely some latent sense for which this place affords no gratification, or he has some desires distinct from sense which must be satisfied before he can be happy."
Thank you. Sorry.
After this, he lifted up his head and, seeing the moon rising, walked towards the palace. As he passed through the fields and saw the animals around him, "Ye," said he, "are happy, and need not envy me that walk thus among you, burdened with myself. Nor do I, ye gentle beings, envy your felicity, for it is not the felicity of man. I have many distresses from which ye are free. I fear pain when I do not feel it. I sometimes shrink at evils recollected, and sometimes start at evils anticipated. Surely the equity of Providence has balanced peculiar sufferings with peculiar enjoyments." With observations like these, the prince amused himself as he returned, uttering them with a plaintive voice, yet with a look that discovered him to feel some complacence in his own perspicacity, and to receive some solace of the miseries of life, from consciousness of the delicacy with which he felt, and the eloquence with which he bewailed them. He mingled cheerfully in the diversions of the evening, and all rejoiced to find that his heart was lightened.
Thank you very much. Alex, would you care to continue?
That's fine.
Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, chapter 3. On the next day, his old instructor, imagining that he had now made himself acquainted with his disease of mind, was in hope of curing it by counsel, and officially sought an opportunity of conference, which the prince, having long considered him as one whose intellects were exhausted, was not very willing to afford. "Why," said he, "does this man thus intrude upon me? Shall I be never suffered to forget those lectures which pleased only while they were new, and to become new again must be forgotten?" He then walked into the wood and composed himself to his usual meditations. When before his thoughts had taken any settled form, he perceived his pursuer at his side, and was at first prompted by his impatience to go hastily away. But being unwilling to offend a man whom he had once reverenced and still loved, he invited him to sit down with him on the bank. The old man, thus encouraged, began to lament the change which had been lately observed in the prince, and to inquire why he so often retired from the pleasures of the palace to loneliness and silence. "I fly from pleasure," said the prince, "because pleasure has ceased to please. I am lonely because I am miserable, and am unwilling to cloud with my presence the happiness of others." "You, sir," said the sage, "are the first who has complained of misery in the Happy Valley. I hope to convince you that your complaints have no real cause. You are here in full possession of all that the Emperor of Abyssinia can bestow. Here is neither labour to be endured, nor danger to be dreaded. Yet here is all that labour or danger can procure. Look round and tell me which of your wants is without supply. If you want nothing, how are you unhappy? That I want nothing, said the prince, or that I know not what I want, is the cause of my complaint. If I had any known want, I should have a certain wish. That wish would excite endeavour, and I should not then repine to see the sun move so slowly towards the western mountain, or lament when the day breaks and sleep will no longer hide me from myself. When I see the kids and the lambs chasing one another, I fancy that I should be happy if I had something to pursue. But possessing all that I can want, I find one day and 1 hour exactly like another, except that the latter is still more tedious than the former. Let your experience inform me how the day may now seem as short as in my childhood, while nature was yet fresh, and every moment showed me what I had never had observed before. I have already enjoyed too much. Give me something to desire. The old man was surprised at this new species of affliction, and knew not what to reply, yet was unwilling to be silent. Sir, said he, if you had seen the miseries of the world, you would know how to value your present state. Now, said the prince, you have given me something to desire. I shall long to see the miseries of the world, since the sight of them is necessary to happiness.
Thanks very much indeed. Danielle, would you fancy continuing the reading? Daniel, are you there? Otherwise, Mick, perhaps you would. Oh, you're okay. Okay, great. Thanks, Daniel.
All right. Sorry for problems. Chapter 4. The prince continues to grieve and muse. At this time, the sound of music proclaimed the hours of repast, and the conversation was concluded. The old man went away sufficiently disconnected to find that his reasonings had produced the only conclusion which they were intended to prevent. But in the decline of life, shame and grief are of short duration. Whether it be what we bear easily, what we have borne long, or that, finding ourselves in age less regarded, we less regarded others, or that we look with slight regard upon afflictions, to which we know that the hand of death is about to put an end. The prince, whose views were extended to a wider space, could not speedily quiet his emotions. He had been before terrified at the length of life which nature promised him, because he considered that in a long time much must be endured. He now rejoiced in his youth, because in many years much might be done. This first beam of hope that had been ever darted into his mind rekindled youth in his cheeks and doubled the lustre of his eyes. He was fired with the desire of doing something, though he knew not yet with distinctness either end or means. He was no longer gloomy or unsocial, but, considering himself as master of a secret flock of happiness, which he could enjoy only by concealing it, he affected to be busy in all schemes of diversion, and endeavored to make others pleased with the state of which he himself was weary. But pleasures never can be so multiplied or continued as not to leave much or life unemployed. There were many hours, both of the night and day, which he could spend without suspicion in solitary thought. The load of life was much lightened. He went eagerly into the assemblies, because he supposed the frequency of his presence necessary to the success of his purpose. He retired gladly to privacy, because he had now a subject of thought. His chief amusement was not picture to himself that world which he had never seen, to place himself in various conditions, to be entangled in imaginary difficulties, and to be engaged in wild adventures. But his benevolence always terminated his projects in the relief of distress, the detection of fraud, the defeat of oppression, and the diffusion of happiness. Thus passed 20 months of the life of Rasselas. He busied himself so intensely in visionary bustle that he forgot his real solitude and, amidst hourly preparations for the various incidents of human affairs, neglected to consider by what means he should mingle with mankind. One day, as he was sitting on the bank, he found to himself an orphan virgin robbed of her little portion by a treacherous lover, and crying after him for restitution and redress. So strongly was the image impressed upon his mind that he started up in the made defense and ran forward to seize the plunderer with all the eagerness of real pursuit. Fear naturally quickens the flight of guilt. Rasselas could not catch the fugitive with his utmost efforts, but, resolving to weary by perseverance him whom he could not surpass in speed, he pressed until the foot of the mountain stopped his course. Here he recollected himself and smiled at his own useless impetuosity. Then raising his eyes to the mountain, "This," said he, "is a fatal obstacle that hinders at once the enjoyment of pleasure and the exercise of virtue. How long is it that my hopes and wishes have flown beyond this boundary of my life, which yet I never have attempted to surmount?" Struck with this reflection, he sat down to muse, and remembered that since he first resolved to escape from his confinement, the sun had passed twice over him in his annual course. He now felt a degree of regret with which he had never been before acquainted. He considered how much might have been done in the time which had passed, and left nothing real behind it. He compared 20 months with the life of man. "In life," said he, "is not to be counted the ignorance of infancy or imbecility of age. We are long before we are able to think, and we soon keys for the power of acting. The true period of human existence may be reasonably estimated as 40 years, of which I have mused away the 24th part. And I have lost was certain, for I have certainly possessed it. But of 20 months to come, who can assure me?" The consciousness of his own folly pierced him deeply, and he was long before he could be reconciled to himself. "The rest of my time," said he, "has been lost by the crime or folly of my ancestor and the absurd institutions of my country. I remember it with disgust, but without remorse. But the months that I have passed since new light darted into my soul, since I formed a scheme of reasonable felicity, have been squandered by my own fault. I have lost that which can never be restored. I have seen the sun rise and set for 20 months, an idle gazer on the light of heaven. In this time, the birds have left the nest of their mother and committed themselves to the woods and to the skies. The kid has forsaken the teat and learned by degrees to climb the rocks in quest of independent sustenance. I only have made no advances, but I'm still helpless and ignorant. The moon, by more than 20 changes, admonished me of the flux of life. The stream that rolled before my feet upbraided my inactivity. I sat feasting on intellectual luxury, regardless alike of the examples of the earth and instructions of the planets. 20 months are past. Who shall restore them? These sorrowful meditations fastened upon his mind. The past 4 months in the resolving to lose no more time in idle resolves, and was awakened to more vigorous exertion by hearing a maid who had broken a porcelain cup remark, and what cannot be repaired is not to be regretted. This was obvious, and Rasselas reproached himself that he had not discovered it, having not known or not considered how many useful hints are obtained by chance, and how often the mind, hurried by her own ardor to distant views, neglects the truths that lie open before her. He, for a few hours, regretted his regret, and from that time bent his whole mind upon the means of escaping from the Valley of Happiness.
Thanks very much. Edith, would you like to take over?
Chapter 5, the prince meditates his escape. He now found that it would be very difficult to effect that which it was very easy to suppose effected. When he looked round about him, he saw himself confined by the bars of nature, which had never yet been broken, and by the gate through which none that once had passed it were ever able to return. He was now impatient as an eagle in great. He passed week after week in clambering the mountains to see if there was any aperture which the bushes might conceal, but found all the summits inaccessible by their prominence. The iron gate he despaired to open, for it was not only secured with all the power of art, but was always watched by successive sentinels, and was by its position exposed to the perpetual observation of all the inhabitants. He then examined the cavern through which the waters of the lake were discharged, and looking down at a time when the sun shone strongly upon its mouth, he discovered it to be full of broken rocks, which, though they permitted the stream to flow through many narrow passages, would stop any body of solid bulk. He returned discouraged and dejected, but having now known the blessing of hope, resolved never to despair. In these fruitless searches he spent 10 months. The time, however, passed cheerfully away. In the morning he rose with new hope, in the evening applauded his own diligence, and in the night slept sound after his fatigue. He met 1,000 amusements which beguiled his labour and diversified his thoughts. He discerned the various instincts of animals and properties of plants, and found the place replete with wonders, of which he purposed to solace himself with the contemplation if he should never be able to accomplish his flight, rejoicing that his endeavours, though yet unsuccessful, had supplied him with a source of inexhaustible inquiry. But his original curiosity was not yet abated. He resolved to obtain some knowledge of the ways of men. His wish still continued, but his hope grew less. He ceased to survey any longer the walls of his prison, and spared to search by new toils for interstices which he knew could not be found, yet determined to keep his design always in view and lay hold on any expedient that time should offer.
Thank you. Vladimir, would you like to talk a bit about flying here?
Do you mean to read or?
Yes, please. Yes, sorry. Yes.
I'm afraid it's too fine text in English. I can't cope with it because a lot of difficult words.
Yeah. No. It's not the easiest. I entirely agree. Mick, would you be kind enough to take up the reading? Mick, are you there? If not, Michael.
Sorry, Sted. Could you not hear me then?
Sorry, no, I couldn't.
Oh, I just read the first paragraph, but
oh dear, right.
I think your audio was off then, Mick.
Oh, okay, explains everything then. Right, I'll go again then. Okay, chapter 6, a dissertation on the art of flying. Among the artists that have been allured into the Happy Valley to labour for the accommodation and pleasure of its inhabitants was a man eminent for his both of use and recreation. By a wheel which the stream turned, he forced the water into a tower, whence it was distributed to all the apartments of the palace. He erected a pavilion in the garden, around which he kept the air always cool by artificial showers. One of the groves, appropriated to the ladies, was ventilated by fans, to which the rivulet that runs through it gave constant motion, and instruments of soft music were placed at proper distances, of which some played by the impulse of the wind, and some by the power of the stream. This artist was sometimes visited by Rasselas, who was pleased with every kind of knowledge, imagining that the time would come when all his acquisitions should be of use to him in the open world. He came one day to amuse himself in his usual manner, and found the master busy in building a sailing chariot. He saw that the design was practicable on a level surface, and with expressions of great esteem solicited its completion. The workman was pleased to find himself so much regarded by the prince, and resolved to gain yet higher honours. Sir, said he, you have seen but a small part of what the mechanic sciences can perform. I have been long of opinion that instead of the tardy conveyance of ships and chariots, man might use the swifter migration of wings, that the fields of air are open to knowledge, and that only ignorance and idleness need crawl upon the ground. This hint rekindled the prince's desire of passing the mountains, and having seen what the mechanist had already performed, he was willing to fancy that he could do more, yet resolved to inquire further before he differed hope to afflict him by disappointment. I'm afraid, said he to the artist, that your imagination prevails over your skill, and that you now tell me rather what you wish than what you know. Every animal has his element assigned to him, the birds of the air, and man and beast the earth. So, replied the mechanist, fishes have the water, in which yet beasts can swim by nature, and men by art. He that can swim needs not despair to fly. To swim is to fly in the grosser fluid, and to fly is to swim the subtler. We are only to proportion our powers of the different density of the matter for which we are to pass. You will be necessarily upborne by the air. If you can renew any impulse upon it, faster than the air can recede from the pressure. But the exercise of swimming, said the prince, is very laborious. The strongest limbs are soon wearied. I'm afraid the art of flying will be yet more violent, and wings will be of no great use unless we can fly further than we can swim. The labour of rising from the ground, said the artist, will be great, as we see it in the heavier domestic fowls. But we as we mount higher, the Earth's attraction and the body's gravity will gradually diminish, till we shall arrive at a region where the man will float in the air without any tendency to fall. No care will then be necessary, but to move forwards, which the gentlest impulse will effect. You, sir, whose curiosity is so extensive, will easily conceive with what pleasure a philosopher, furnished with wings and hovering in the sky, would see the earth and all its inhabitants rolling beneath him, and presented to him successively by its diurnal motion, all the countries within the same parallel. How must it amuse the pendant spectator to see the moving scene of land and ocean, cities and deserts, to survey with equal security the marts of trade and the fields of battle, mountains infested by barbarians and fruitful regions gladdened by plenty and lulled by peace. How easily shall we then trace the Nile through all his passage, pass over to distant regions, and examine the face of nature from one extremity of the earth to the other. All this, said the prince, is much to be desired, but I'm afraid that no man will be able to breathe in these regions of speculation and tranquility. I have been told that respiration is difficult upon lofty mountains, yet from these precipices, though so high as to produce great tenuity of the air, it is very easy to fall, and I suspect that from any height where life can be supported, there may be danger of too quick descent. Nothing, replied the artist, will ever be attempted, if all possible objections must first be overcome. If you will favour my project, I will try the first flight at my own hazard. I have considered the structure of all volant animals and find the folding community of the bat's wings most easily accommodated to the human form. Upon this model, I shall begin my task tomorrow, and in a year expect to tower into the air beyond the malice or pursuit of man. But I will work only on this condition, that the art shall not be divulged, and that you shall not require me to make wings for any but ourselves. Why, said Rasselas, should you envy others so great an advantage? All skill ought to be exerted for universal good. Every man has owed much to others and ought to repay the kindness that he has received. If men were all virtuous, returned the artist, I should with great alacrity teach them all to fly. But what would be the security of the good if the bad could at pleasure invade them from the sky? Against an army sailing through the clouds, neither walls, nor mountains, nor seas could afford any security. A flight of northern savages might hover in the wind and light at once with irresistible violence upon the capital of a fruitful region that was rolling under them. Even this valley, the retreat of princes, the abode of happiness, might be violated by the sudden descent of some of the naked nations that swarm on the coast of the southern sea. The prince promised secrecy and waited for the performance, not wholly less of success. He visited the work from time to time, observed its progress, and remarked the ingenious contrivances to facilitate motion and unite levity with strength. The artist was every day more certain that he could leave vultures and eagles behind him, and the contagion of his confidence seized upon the prince. In a year, the wings were finished, and on a morning appointed, the maker appeared furnished for flight on a little promontory. He waved his pinions a while to gather air, and then leaped from his stand and in an instant dropped into the lake. His wings, which were of no life in the air, sustained him in the water, and the prince drew him to land, half dead with terror and vexation.
Thank you. Yeah, it was it was a big build-up and a fairly short account of the flop. Paul, would you care to read? Paul, are you there? But if you're speaking, you're on mute. If you are, but maybe you've gone away. There was one chapter I wanted to get to that describes literature that I thought was good to end on. I think that is number 10. In which case, Michael from Cologne perhaps could do that. I'll just see if that's number 10. I think it's yeah. Michael, would you like to read chapter 10?
Mm-hmm. Chapter 10, yeah.
I think this is a really interesting and very fine passage, and very appropriate maybe for us to pause on this one afterwards. So please.
Chapter 10, Imlac's History Continued, a dissertation upon poetry. Wherever I went, I found that poetry was considered as the highest learning and regarded with a veneration somewhat approaching to that which man would pay to the angelic nature. And it yet fills me with wonder that in almost all countries, the most ancient poets are considered as the best, whether it be that every other kind of knowledge is an acquisition gradually attained, and poetry is a gift conferred at once, or that the first poetry of every nation surprised them as a novelty and retained the credit by consent which it received by accident at first, or whether the province of poetry is to describe nature and passion, which are always the same, and the first writers took possession of the most striking objects for description and the most probable occurrences for fiction, and left nothing to those that followed them, but transcription of the same events and new combinations of the same images. Whatever be the reason, it is commonly observed that the early writers are in possession of nature and their followers of art, that the first excel in strength and invention and the latter in elegance and refinement. I was desirous to add my name to this illustrious fraternity. I read all the poets of Persia and Arabia and was able to repeat by memory the volumes that are suspended in the mosque of Mecca. But I soon found that no man was ever great by imitation. My desire of excellence impelled me to transfer my attention to nature and to life. Nature was to be my subject and men to be my auditors. I should never describe what I had not seen. I could not hope to move those with delight or terror whose interests and opinions I did not understand. Being now resolved to be a poet, I saw everything with a new purpose. My sphere of attention was suddenly magnified. No kind of knowledge was to be overlooked. I ranged mountains and deserts for images and resemblances, and pictured upon my mind every tree of the forest and flower of the valley. I observed with equal care the crags of the rock and the pinnacles of the palace. Sometimes I wandered along the mazes of the rivulet, and sometimes watched the changes of the summer clouds. To a poet, nothing can be useless. Whatever is beautiful and whatever is dreadful must be familiar to his imagination. He must be conversant with all that is awfully vast or elegantly little. The plants of the garden, the animals of the wood, the minerals of the earth, and meteors of the sky must all concur to store his mind with inexhaustible variety. For every idea is useful for the enforcement or decoration of moral or religious truth. And he who knows most will have most power of diversifying his scenes and of gratifying his reader with remote allusions and unexpected instruction. All the appearances of nature I was therefore careful to study, and every country which I have surveyed has contributed something to my poetical powers. In so wide a survey, said the prince, you must surely have left much unobserved. I have lived till now within the circuit of these mountains, and yet cannot walk abroad without the sight of something which I had never beheld before or never heeded. The business of a poet, said Imlac, is to examine not the individual, but the species, to remark general properties and large appearances. He does not number the streaks of the tulip or describe the different shades in the verdure of the forest. He is to exhibit in his portraits of nature such prominent and striking features as recall the original to every mind, and must neglect the minuter discriminations, which one may have remarked and another have neglected, for those characteristics which are alike obvious to vigilance and carelessness. But the knowledge of nature is only half the talk of a poet. He must be acquainted likewise with all the modes of life. His character requires that he estimate the happiness and misery of every condition, observe the power of all the passions in all their combinations, and trace the changes of the human mind as they are modified by various institutions and accidental influences of climate or custom, from the sprightliness of infancy to the despondence of decrepitude. He must divest himself of the prejudices of his age or country. He must consider right and wrong in their abstracted and invariable state. He must disregard present laws and opinions and rise to general and transcendental truths, which will always be the same. He must therefore content himself with the slow progress of his name, contemn the applause of his own time, and commit his claims to the justice of posterity. He must write as the interpreter of nature and the legislator of mankind, and consider himself as presiding over the thoughts and manners of successive generations, as a being superior to time and place. His labor is not yet at an end. He must know many languages and many sciences, and, that his style may be worthy of his thoughts, must, by incessant practice, familiarize to himself every delicacy of speech and grace of harmony.
Thank you very much, Michael. I mean, that might be quite a good passage to discuss. I mean, it put forward very cogently what is, one may assume, the author's view of the proper aims of a poet, which I think this work, to some extent, although it's not poetry, it does illustrate some of those tendencies. Let's stop the share. Michael, you read the passage. What was your thought? What were your thoughts about that?
My thoughts were less on the passage than everything else, because I think when you read something, you have less time to think about it. But my immediate impression it was very platonic, wasn't it? It was
yes,
seeking for the essence of things rather than the
trying to find
what
is superior to time and place, the general rather than the particular, which as I spoke about in the introduction, does characterize how he frames his description of things to to avoid the clear characterization of the characters. Perhaps a lot of people will not be familiar with Dr. Johnson's prose and the whole quite sort of heavy quality it has. What were people's reactions to it? Did people like it or find it too wordy and over kind of developed? Michael in London. Oh, sorry, no, you're not in London. You're in Amsterdam. What was your?
No, I liked his language. I found it flows very gently.
Yeah.
He's a master at what the words that he chooses. I was quite impressed with it, and I don't know the overall story, so I kept thinking, with Rasselas's desire to leave the Valley of Happiness, it was so much like the Buddha, wanting to leave his.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
His palace of luxuries and delight, and to encounter the outside world, and yet at the same time, of course, the emphasis is much more on. Well, I mean, he has pleasure, yet he keeps talking about pleasure. So he takes a different approach, of course, to the Buddha. Rasselas becomes rekindled in his earlier searches, unlike the Buddha, who is almost emaciated because I think he's eating 1 grain of rice a day at some point, until he finally comes to the conclusion of going for the middle way. And not this extreme asceticism. So, I mean, there's interesting contrasts, and how much Johnson had the narrative of a Sakyamuni in mind. I'd be really curious.
That is interesting. Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I was surprised at how knowledgeable he was about the Middle East and other cultures, and how interested he seems to have been. One always thinks of him as the kind of bluff Englishman who was happy to make derogatory remarks about Scotsmen and things like that. But I think that is just a superficial part of him, really. I don't think it reflects the true nature of the man. One thing that he did, one distinction that does seem to be true of the time in the Happy Valley, is between enjoyment and desire. That's to say, a sort of sensual satisfaction, i.e. enjoyment, and desire that's more about aspiring to something, to have plans, it's similar to the difference between the pursuit of happiness and the obtaining of it. Having a plan that one thinks will lead to happiness, getting something sorted out. And I think that was an important sort of theme to him. That one had to have some kind of object in one's life that one was heading towards, and that would give genuine satisfaction, rather than having the most exquisite meals as one would do on a cruise and not having to do anything, maybe.
And by contrast, the Buddha, of course, counters all desire. He's not using desire as Rasselas is. He's trying to quench all desire, because that only leads to unhappiness.
Yes, indeed. Well, yeah, I mean, whether they're using desire in quite the same way, I don't know. But yeah, that is a very definite difference that I think is the case. The idea of renunciation is not one that I'm perhaps that seems to really occur in Rasselas, except in a negative way. There is a sort of hermit who, when they I think get to speak to him, and he quite enjoys talking to the two ladies, he profoundly declares that his period of hermitage was not really a good idea after all. So I don't think he would really have the same view about desire, which is an interesting thing. I mean, did anyone have any views about the final passage about literature, the idea that is a good thing for people to do, to focus on the general? Vladimir, please. What?
Yes, thank you. Yes, to me, this story of Johnson reminds me in certain way, say, the style of Carlos Castaneda, who describes like a perfect person in somewhere in exotic environment, and same with Rasselas. But the point is that nor Castaneda describes a real Indian mysticism or customs, but it's just like a Platonic, as Michael said, Platonic imagination of something what is perfect. And the very style of it is to help author to abstract, to disassociate with his own cultural identity and to pick up something from the heavens, something more ideal. Same with Rasselas and with Johnson. So he's trying to set up a typical, I would say, like this English gentleman style of thinking, of approaching to everything. So this is really like English classics, and very nice language, first of all, absolutely the brilliant. And the way of thinking and the culture of speech and everything. And this is exactly, that has nothing to do to me with the real Abyssinian culture or Abyssinian mentality, with the metaphysics of anything, but it's really like the pure English or British. I don't know who was Johnson, English or
yes, English.
The pure like English way of view. What is also very interesting for me personally, that it looks like Samuel Johnson studied at the Pembroke College in Oxford, exactly the place where my son Philip is studying right now, but even not English literature, but pure mathematics. But nevertheless, it's really, really like nice for me to know that he will have a kind of connection to the classical English culture in that way.
Vladimir, you must give him a copy of Rasselas as a present on his birthday or Yuletide.
Yes, I'll do that.
It's a short book and it's nice. Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yes.
I suppose one can see this also in the context of the distinction between Romanticism and Classicism, that the Romantic movement was very much about finding beauty in the particular rather than the general. You're sagely nodding, Michael.
I think that was quite right. I think there was a sort of element of the anti-romantic in that. In the writing, as far as I understood it. And this suggestion of course, human nature is the same everywhere, which I would think is essentially anti-romantic as well.
Yeah,
anti-romantic stresses individuality and the difference between human beings. I do like to throw in a fun question to see if anybody gets the answer here, if I may, because he mentioned he stated human nature is the same everywhere. Was that I think it was
yes.
Well, what famous character in literature says again and again, "Oh my dear, human nature is the same everywhere," you know? So it's a competition for everybody. What famous character in many books in English says human nature is the same everywhere?
It has a very familiar ring to it, doesn't it?
It should do. See if anybody gets it. I'll promise I'll send them a Mars bar when the lockdowns are.
Sounds like something a detective would say.
Oh, she's getting very close. Keep going.
I was going to say Sherlock Holmes.
No, not Sherlock Holmes.
It's Poirot then.
I'll give you half a Mars bar. It's Miss Marple. She says it in almost everything. You know, somebody says, well, of course, my dear old woman doesn't have much you don't have so much experience of human nature in this little village of St. Mary Mead. She says, my dear, you'd be surprised. Human nature is much the same everywhere.
Yeah.
And of course, whether that's true or not is open to doubt. Although I'm not sure, did Johnson have this idea that people were the same? Of course, that's not the same thing, because the idea that human nature is the same, you can have different types, and Agatha Christie always produced these types, or certain characters that keep recurring in the books. Is that Johnson's view as well, or is it more that everybody, which can almost slip into a kind of Marxism, if that doesn't sound too bizarre, that everybody is essentially the same if circumstances were different and worked on them in the same way? You know, I don't know if you see what I mean.
And the alternative...
The alternative would be that human nature is the same, but you have, you know, the adventurer type, the dishonest type. I mean, it's a very conservative view that almost that these people are never going to change. That's the way they are. You know, once a criminal, always a criminal.
Yeah.
Once a coward, always a coward. Once a hero, always a hero. Which it sort of does, I think, very much exist in Agatha Christie's works. And then there's this more sort of, you know, no, everything's affected by nature and circumstances, which is, I wondered which Johnson
there doesn't seem to be evidence for that view here. When they travel to different places and speak to different people, it seems to be, you know, the first few you stated that people's actions are dependent upon the circumstances. For instance, the Arab that kidnaps one of the ladies. I mean, he is a civilized man, and he's only doing this because the Turks have invaded his country and stopped him from getting money other ways. It's not that he's intrinsically you know, inclined to live in that way. And yes, I mean, Johnson does seem to be a kind of a rationalist in that thinks of man as a rational animal, or that's the most important thing that defines what makes the man a man.
So in optimal circumstances, all people would be very good and kind to each other.
Yeah, I mean, he was a Christian, so I think he thought that there was sin implicit in people. But you know, but I mean, he was a very bright, very intelligent man. So I think on all these questions, I'm sure if he were here, he would be able to say something that was very nuanced and witty and. Would evade easy classification. I mean, he was a very big figure. Borges said, you know, how much he admired the balance and the form, the rounded quality of the sentences. And I mean, I found myself tending to be influenced, I think, by that kind of periodic style. And I think my introduction at times did verge on that, but without really I wasn't intending to.
18th century, you know.
Yes, indeed, and I think it does that because it's a powerful vision of the world, and it affects how one sees the world, you know. So it
was characteristic of its time, wasn't it? Kind of, I mean, Pope, Dryden.
Yeah.
They all wrote in this very lucid, very harmonious, and you can say classic style.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, indeed, very balanced. But the book was very popular, as I said, and it's still in print, and you know, so that's good. And it's probably the thing by by him which is most read.
Mm.
Everyone is familiar with him as a character, a person who makes comments on things, particularly from Boswell's Life of Johnson, and that. But as to actually things that people have read, this is definitely the thing that the majority of people, most people have read. It's very good to have recourse to his dictionary to look up any words that seem a bit strange, because the sense has changed slightly for a lot of the words he uses. Officious was much more positive when he used it. It was much more akin to being helpful, and yeah, there are quite a lot of cases where the connotation has slipped slightly, but not to make it incapable of being understood, but but affected emotional colouring of it.
It was interesting to know. I thought that he makes the distinction between felicity and happiness, and we've lost that almost in modern English. I mean, very few people use the word felicity, and if you do, it sounds almost pretentious to use the word.
Yes.
So that it's all happiness, whereas felicity, as I understand, is almost this sort of state of this sort of almost aspiration of this, whatever it is, the Garden of Eden or something like this, whereas happiness is just in relation to particular earthly events. At least that's how I...
Shall I try and find out the succinct way Johnson defines felicity in his dictionary? That might be fun.
Yes, absolutely.
Hang on, yeah, let's see if we can find that. He defines it, obviously it's a word of many senses, but he does define it with a connotation leading more towards the appropriate joy of the soul. He describes it in 4 words: happiness, prosperity, blessedness, and blissfulness. And the last 2 are much more of a spiritual nature, I think. It's out of interest to see how he defines happiness. Let's see. And let's hope it's not exactly the same.
Maybe it is.
No, he state in which the desires are satisfied.
Yeah, no, that's exactly. No, then I think I'm on the right course. Yeah.
Good luck, good fortune, fortuitous elegance, unstudied grace. That's another sense, I think. The good thing about Johnson's dictionary is that he illustrates it with quotations from literature, which is a very good practice linguistically, because it rather than just producing these things out of his own head, I mean, the way he made the dictionary was writing down words on a card system, which was an impeccable way of proceeding to make an evidence-based dictionary. So it was a monumental achievement at the time. Anyone else? Daniel, as a non-English speaker, how did you find the language? I think it's tricky for even English speakers. You're on mute, Daniel.
Sorry, it was mute.
Yeah.
It's a bit difficult for me as not a native English speaker. I will look if I can get a German translation of the book, and I will see if I can order it.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that's possible.
On the dictionary, I always thought it's rather amusing that he put his own opinions in. For example, he was a high Tory, and his definition of a wig, in other words, who later became the Liberal Party, was a scoundrel, I think, if I remember correctly. Then it was his definition of a Tory was probably a patriot or something like that.
I think actually, I mean, I wonder whether he actually put other things and just added that. But given the amount of work he did, I think he was entitled to have a bit of fun, really.
Oh, I think that's true. Yes, I've got to go shortly, so I just want to wish you all a happy Christmas.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thanks for coming, Robert.
Thank you.
And
thank you very much.
I'll see you the next time.
Okay. Yeah, next time. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye, Robin.
Bye.
Thanks for
Bye.
reading. Yeah, I just typed in wig, and he does straightforwardly list one of the meanings, the name of a faction, and he also puts down way, WHEY. Whether that means what I think it means, which is a milk product, I don't know. I didn't know that wig was a name for that. I'm not. There doesn't seem to be scoundrel here, actually. Now Robin's gone. Maybe some of those accounts of what's in his dictionary are apocryphal, and they're actually
That's quite possible.
Because he is such a character, and I'm sure lots of people said things about him that weren't true, because it was this kind of John Ball character, which is not really borne out.
Well, it's not, isn't it? I mean, the writing contrasts with the image that most people probably have of him from Boswell's Life of Johnson, which is probably what, certainly in my case, my familiarity with him is only from that.
Yeah.
Because this seems to be a much more placid and philosophical and reflective, perhaps unfair, but certainly philosophical or deeply reflective person than the image that one has from Boswell of this intelligent but somewhat cynical, and I would tend to say superficial, because the image is given to me by Boswell of this man who's always quick to quip or make a comment on the condition of life in Scotland or Scottish hotel bills or whatever it is, but doesn't seem to be a profound thinker, to be honest. And this comes over something different. I mean, presenting the eternal issue of if you have achieved what you want to achieve, what then? Are you confronted with boredom? And is heaven really an interesting place? I mean, you have to go to, if you're going to be one of the saved, you're going to be there forever, which is a long time. How are you going to amuse yourself? You know, and this is a pretty basic question, and he really poses it there with his Valley, doesn't he?
That's interesting. Yeah, so you that came into your mind. That did come.
Oh, absolutely, very strongly.
That is very good. Yeah. No, that is good. Michael in Amsterdam, did that come into your mind? I mean, you made
definitely. Yeah,
that is interesting.
I mean, it is the whole question of ultimate contentment, and
yes.
Where do you go from there?
I mean, I think contentment is due to having projects of some sort that one is advancing.
Challenges.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Challenges.
Yeah. It's like if you collect stamps, as I do. If somebody gave me a collection with my album completely filled, that might be very nice, but actually I wouldn't be very grateful. It would be sort of the end of my stamp collecting.
Yeah.
It would sort of, although logically that's what I'm striving to do, and I'll never succeed. There's no possible way. But if somebody did it for me, or if I became a millionaire, then my stamp collecting would be destroyed.
The pleasure is in the pursuit, not in the obtaining, I think.
Yeah, that's Hawthorne. That's Nathaniel Hawthorne.
Yeah. Alex, sorry, you've got your hand up, haven't you? Please jump in.
No, I mean, it just reminds me of something I read. I was interested in Carl Jung for a while, and I think it was Jung, but he was talking about the anima. Oh, have you heard of this? The idea of the anima?
Yeah.
And it is really the thing that you pursue, and it seems to be essential for happiness. I think it was Jung, might have been someone else, a long time ago. Yeah, and certainly for me, I'm the same. I like projects. That kicks me
happy.
Yes, problem solving, in short, is what has kept us. We're all the descendants of people that survived problems of how to live in the Ice Age and things like that. Therefore, we are people that have managed to make it through difficulties and to some extent have thrived in them. And I think that is an important thing. And probably the ideal Happy Valley would be a place where quite a lot of bad things occasionally happened and people had to gang together to form friendships, to deal with them, to help each other out and things like that. I don't know. It's the psychological idea of happiness is a much more complex one. It's not the most happy people are not those who live in the perfect kind of welfare state necessarily. It's you know, one can't really make.
Did
Sorry.
Aristotle actually, was he able to define happiness? He said that was the goal of everybody, but does he actually define happiness? I think not. I think happiness is one of those states or whatever it is that it can't be defined.
Yeah. No. I think that's true. Animals. Animals seem. Well, I can't really make it, but the birds seem reasonably happy out there singing, and they have quite a hard life, don't they? I mean, they don't, they haven't invented fire yet, so at night time, it must be rather miserable. They come out.
Well, their feathers keep them fairly warm, but it's a good point. Are animals content or happy? I mean, that's a very difficult point, actually. I would say cautiously that the higher up the kind of ladder you go, the more you move from contentment to happiness. Almost you go through a phase of surviving into the sort of contentment area, which is sort of birds and small mammals. And by the time you get to apes, I think you can begin to talk about happiness and unhappiness. I mean, apes that kept in solitary confinement or subject to experiment show every sign of something that looks like human unhappiness. I don't think you can really just say uncomfortable and discontented, which is exactly, of course, by the way, what vivisectionists always carefully use those words because they don't want to use the word unhappy. They always say uncomfortable or discontented because unhappy gets too close to the human. That would be my feeling would be that you go, but to say that a bird is unhappy.
One of the points I suppose I'm leaning more to is that the Happy Valley is an entirely unnatural state. Where people don't have to do anything at all, and there's no. I mean, he is a prince, but he's not acting as a prince. He's not doing princely duties. He's waiting to become the king. He doesn't have any real power.
Right. So it's like Garden of Eden, and then they have, of course, in Genesis, the lamb laid down with the lion, and you think, well, biologically, this is crazy. What's the lamb doing lying down with the lion, and why has the lion got any claws? I mean, what's going on? It doesn't.
Yeah. I wonder how happy he was. He seems to have been a very sociable man, and. But this question of how to live does seem to perhaps have been a preoccupation with him, which I don't think he had any pat answer to, which is nice, because lots of people do, don't they? So that is a refreshing thing about Rasselas. It's not doctrinaire, everything's left quite open at the end, and it's honest in that way. No, anyone with any further thoughts? I think we could sort of, move this towards an end. I think we've had a taste of it. Mick, what was your thoughts? Have you read any Johnson before? You're on mute, please. Sorry.
Yeah, I have, but I've never read that before. So it was just one of those books, that I knew of the existence of, but just never got around to actually. Having a look in it,
Yeah. Paul, are you there, or you've gone off to do something else? Paul, I think perhaps he's not there anymore. Well, shall we move towards our roast dinners or whatever we'll be moving towards, Michael, as the titular head of.
I moved towards my double daily exercise now, having
What are you doing? What are you doing?
Oh, nothing. I'm nothing like you. I know my son sees you on his Twitter thing or whatever it is. I don't understand this technology, but apparently you can see where you run because he runs as well.
Oh, good.
He said, good. Yeah, quite amazing. So he's very impressed that someone of your age runs wherever you run.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
But
I've been
I haven't followed the
things,
details,
yeah.
but he says, poor kräftiger Kerl.
Oh, good. Oh, excellent. Oh, well, I'm
very. But no, I just do a very fast walk for about 2 miles. That's all, but twice a day.
Walking is very good exercise.
Yeah,
I mean, walking is good. I mean, don't put yourself down, Michael. I mean, that's good. That is good.
Yeah, but anyway, but absolutely, good to see so many people. Thanks, amazingly, Stead. Please, if anybody wants to introduce or talk about a figure in literature, write to Stead or me. Very, very welcome. It shouldn't always be us, I feel. Stead introduced an idea, which I thought was a fascinating idea, of having different texts, perhaps not saying who the texts are by, if I understood your idea correctly.
Yeah, that might be fun. We can
that'd definitely be fun, yeah.
We'll just read a text and we'll talk about it afterwards, and but
without people necessarily knowing if this is a particularly famous writer or not, and see if we make fools of ourselves and say, well, is it making a fool of yourself? Come to that and say, no, this is rubbish, and then say, oh, it's Jane Austen or something. You can say, well, I still think it's rubbish, whatever, but extreme example. Because when we're confronted with a text, if we know who, this is a classic, this is a famous writer, there's a certain kind of prejudice, certain things start going to motion. And it would be interesting if somebody's just confronted with a text that maybe they don't know. I think that would be, personally, I would find that very interesting.
And it would be relatively easy to do because we could just get a text and
maybe one or two texts, yeah.
Yeah, yes, indeed. No, that I think is good, and we're quite busy now. All right, then. Very, 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 very good to see everyone here. Michael, perhaps you can,
well, obviously, I certainly hope that I'll be able to send something that we'll be doing in January next year. I don't see anything more this year. Well, I think it's been a fairly successful year for this very small literary club. I hope you feel the same way. Do feel free to write in comments, as I say, particularly stress if you'd like yourself to introduce a writer or something. Please let us know, because it shouldn't just be Stead and I all the time. And I wish you all very happy Christmas. I'm going to make any comments about the circumstances that we're living under, because that's only gloomy. But I wish you the best possible Christmas under the circumstances, and hope to see you all again in perhaps a better, brighter 2022. Anyway, certainly for Soteria.
Yeah, I hope we all manage to find our own portion of particular happiness this
the happy Valley,
Yuletide. Indeed, it's the most appropriate text to read on this occasion.
Indeed.
Bye everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.